everyone is clear, because there's two rooms right beside each other here. This meeting is on how the Russian Revolution was lost, and it's going to be given by John Molynaux here to my left. John is a long-time political activist and member of the Socialist Workers' Party, first in Britain, and now in the last number of years here in Ireland. You're probably familiar about the format of our meetings, and it will follow the traditional lines of John will speak for a half an hour, he tells me, and I'll try to keep him to that, because we want to spend the rest of the time after that in debate and discussion. So after John has spoken, please feel free to ask any questions, make points, but I would encourage you to, I know it's a relatively small meeting, there's 12 or 15 of us here, but allow time for other people to get in too. You'll notice that the meeting is being filmed by this camera here, so if you don't want for any reason that you are filmed during the discussion or whatever, just please indicate as you begin to speak. It's an intriguing title for the meeting we have, How the Russian Revolution Was Lost, and intriguing mainly because of the meeting that happened in the room just before it, that perhaps some of you were at, How the Russian Revolution Was Won. And I filled two glasses, well, not quite, and you can decide after the meeting, I suppose, are they half full or half empty? So I'm intrigued to know whether it was won or lost, and how it was lost, if it was, and perhaps you'd welcome John in the normal way.
Right. Okay, thank you, John. Standing in the right place, haven't I?
Yeah, fine, John. Yeah, okay. No problem.
Well, as Colin said, the subject of the meeting earlier in here, which I know some of you heard, was how the Russian Revolution was won, and I think we start from the fact that the Russian Revolution of October 1917 was without doubt the greatest revolution of the 20th century. I would say the greatest, most important revolution in the whole history of humanity up to the present time. At any event, it was the only example we have of working class actually taking power in a whole country and holding it for a period of time. Its immediate predecessor was the Paris Commune, but the Paris Commune lasted only 74 days and was only, as its name implies, in the city of Paris in 1871 before it was crushed. So I believe that the Russian Revolution is of huge importance because of that, the lessons of it and so on, which James was talking about in the last session, of huge importance. But it therefore also means that coming to terms with the legacy of that revolution is hugely important. I suppose to some extent with the passing of time and actually the collapse of communism and so on, this issue is no longer quite as burning as it was. But nonetheless, if you want to stand before working class people and say we need a revolution, as we in the SWP do, I think it also means that you have to be prepared for the answer, well, what went wrong in Russia? Because many people will raise that on the streets. They may not know much about it, but it's an immediate question that comes into people's minds. And I suppose we have to start with just briefly the fact that it did go wrong. Now, I think, I won't spend a lot of time on this. If people want to debate it, fine, but I think it's now pretty generally acknowledged. There was a time when most active socialists believed that Russia was either a workers' paradise or at any rate, the best example in the world of really existing socialism and so on. But I don't think that's widely held now. Anyway, to put it very simply, if you take 1917 and move 20 years on to 1937, you find that what was in 1917 an inspiration to workers everywhere around the world to take power into their own hands through workers' councils in a genuine workers' democracy has become by 1937. A lot of it had gone wrong a lot earlier, but I'm just using that as a benchmark. I'll come back to that later. But was by 1937 a one-party state headed by an all-powerful dictator, Joseph Stalin, who ruled the country through a pretty monstrous apparatus of the secret police, the GPU, went through various names, NKVD and so on, but a fairly monstrous apparatus of the secret police, which in essence still exists, even under Putin, who came from it. That there were by this stage, no real trade unions, no real elections. There were lots of elections, but since the party candidate always won with 99 point something or other percent, every now and again over 100%, you can tell, they were not real elections. The only people who were allowed to stand were either the party candidate or the people approved by the party candidate, and there were no contested elections. And so on. There were no real trade unions, same thing, there were lots of official trade unions, but no trade unions in which workers actually controlled them, and so on. There were also millions of people, we can debate about the numbers but not the facts, millions of people in a network of concentration camps known as the Gulag, where slave labour was employed on a vast scale in the far north and Siberia and so on, including as denizens of that Gulag or as shot in the Lubyanka prison, most of the leading Bolsheviks who led the 1917 revolution. One of the extraordinary facts is that in 1934, which is when the Great Purges started, there were 74 people on the Central Committee. At the next Congress in 1939, by that time, only 14 of those 74 survived. The other 60 were dead or in prison. I mean, an extraordinary figure, if you think about it. Imagine that was true of the Dublin. I mean, some people would welcome it, wouldn't they? But, imagine that was true. But imagine that they'd been killed, not by the revolutionary workers putting them up, but had been shot on the orders of Kenny. Or maybe Avery Gilmore. Well, joke. Anyway, but people like Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Smirnov, Pyatakov, Rykov, all of whom had been leaders in one capacity or another in 1917, all met this fate. The most famous person who didn't actually end up in the Gulag or end up shot in the Lubyanka prison was, of course, Leon Trotsky, but that was because he'd become an oppositionist earlier and had been exiled first to Alma-Ata, then to Turkey, and by this time was in Mexico. But that only postponed his fate because, of course, he was murdered in Mexico by a Stalin agent 3 years later in 19. I just think that it's clear that anybody who calls this kind of society socialism actually does a disservice to socialism. There wasn't equality, there wasn't freedom, there wasn't democracy, there was dictatorship, a rule, not the dictatorship of the proletariat, but dictatorship over the proletariat. The fact that it was done in the name of Marxism and the name of socialism is a problem that we have to cope with. I suppose in much the same way that the Catholic Church has to cope with the fact that the Inquisition was done in the name of God as well, but that is a problem for us and doesn't change the realities. And last of all, I would just say that when, in the period 1989 to 1991, this system that had been established, first in Russia and then across a large part of Eastern Europe, came crashing down, the working class didn't defend it. And that's very, very clear. If this was a worker state, they would have defended it, they would have fought for it, they didn't. Many of them were glad to see it come. We could argue about the numbers, proportions, and so on, of what happened then, but they certainly didn't defend it anywhere where it existed. So I think that the idea, as I say, that to say this as socialist is to do a disservice. So it brings us to the question, how did things go wrong and why? Now, there's the explanation I'm going to put forward, but of course there's some competing explanations. explanations here, and it's worth saying that the bourgeoisie, the ruling classes in the West, have put a lot of effort into getting their account over to people as to why things went wrong. And it comes in various versions. The first version of this, of course, says that it went wrong because of human nature, that the whole idea of creating a socialist society, a classless society, is wrong. Human beings are naturally capitalist, they're naturally selfish, they're naturally acquisitive, and trying to do anything other is bound to lead up in either disaster or dictatorship because it's contrary to the laws of human nature. I once wrote a whole pamphlet on this view. I'm going to be very brief about it now. I want to say that this is piece of nonsense, really. It's the theory of original sin imported into, given the secular version of what was developed by the church for a long time. Human beings are not born sinful or born selfish, or certainly not born capitalists, since capitalism is a late arrival in human history. After couple of million years it took, and several thousands of years of different forms of class society before we got to capitalism around the 16th century. So it doesn't correspond to human nature. In fact, for the vast bulk of human history, we know that people lived in what Marx called primitive communism. That is, they lived in rough equality without class divisions in society. So insofar as there's a human nature, it's not incompatible with socialism at all. And if you look at people's basic needs, which is the core of what you might call human nature, their needs for, obviously for food, drink, shelter, clothing and so on, which are permanent among human beings, plus their needs for a social life, interacting things about human beings. Socialism would meet those basic needs much better than capitalism, which is unable to meet those needs, even when it's as wealthy as it is today, and indeed is threatening to actually destroy the future of the planet on which human nature depends. So I reject that human nature argument. There's also a much more specific argument that our rulers have put a lot of effort into developing, which is that it is the cause of what the dictatorship in Russia was, that this is inherent in Marxism, and particularly in the version of Marxism that we associate with the Russian Revolution, namely that of Lenin and Leninism. The idea is that Marxism, and especially Leninism, aims at totalitarian rule of society from the beginning. James, who's sitting at the back, was talking about the response, or was it, I think, of some trade union officials or something, to leaflets that we were giving out at the bus depots when we were handing out leaflets about the bus workers' dispute that's just been going on, so basically reject the sellout that's been put forward. And the response came, well, James, was it from the union leaders or from the boss?
The head of the NBRU.
The head of the NBRU put a leaflet and said, don't take any notice of these leaflets from these people who are bent on world domination. It's an echo. It's an echo of the argument. You see, you may not know it, but you people who come, you're really out for is world domination. Yeah. Now, well, they have a point. We do want an international revolution. I'll come to it in a minute, you know. But anyway, that's this argument. And this argument ranges from a view that it was particularly Lenin's character that was at fault. I mean, joking about this as a psychological, because this is worth mentioning. You see, Lenin became a revolutionary in the 1890s. He joined a group that had about as many people in it as there were in this room, or maybe this room and that one next door. You know, that was called the League for the Emancipation of Labour. And the first thing, of course, this was under the Tsar, and so they got arrested and sent to Siberia. But you see, what Lenin really wanted to do was to be the dictator of Russia. He thought, oh, what I will do is join this group called the Emancipation of Labour and get myself sent to. The fact that he was born into quite a well-to-do family and so on, and could easily have risen up the Tsarist bureaucracy, that wasn't good enough. He knew that in 1905 there would be a revolution, that then in 1914 there would be a war, then 3 years later he would come to power at the head of an insurrection, and then he'd be dictator of Russia. It was a cunning plan all along. I wish all power-hungry people would take their detours through Siberia on their road. Anyway, I'm joking, but it's a silly argument, but it's also worth noting that it's the great man theory of history inverted. Our rulers have always tended to see history as being made by great men, very occasionally great women if they happen to be queens. But generally speaking, that's how they put it. It's the great leaders who do everything, not right. So this is the great leader theory. This is the bad King John theory. Everything happened to us was a bad ruler. Like they tell you that, why did you get Nazism in Germany? Oh, well, there was this bad man Hitler who captivated all the German people with his power of his oratory. It's a silly explanation, but it's the way they put forward. More serious, though, and a lot of effort has gone, a lot of intellectual effort has gone into developing this theory, is the idea that it was Lenin not just as a personality, but it was the whole notion of the organisation of the Bolsheviks as a revolutionary organisation. That they were a centralist organisation, they were an anti-democratic organisation, and it was the theory of the party that caused everything to go wrong. Lenin's organisational methods and so on. Now, and that the revolution was never a genuine workers' revolution, it was a coup. I'll be, again, very brief on this because I want to get to the main point, but just briefly on this, it's factually incorrect. The Bolshevik Party was an extremely democratic organisation. Lenin often found himself in a minority within it, including in various points in 1917. He had to work very hard to convince the rest of the leaders of the Bolshevik Party that it would be good to stage an uprising in October 1917. You can read his letters, actually, a very fascinating piece of reading. Lenin's letters to the other members of the Central Committee, big emails, I suppose, today. But, he went through this intense process of trying to persuade them and win them over, that from September to October, the time was right to take action. But on many issues, he found himself in the minority. There were different factions at different times, there were disputes, there were arguments. It's a highly democratic organisation. And so on. The only reason Lenin did get his way over this was not because everybody did what he said, or the other leaders all fell into line. The reason he got his way was because what he was saying, and what he was arguing for, was corresponding to what the mass of the worker members of the Bolshevik Party at the base wanted to do. He was arguing at the top, Marxist language and so on, what the workers in the Puchilov works, the great factory in Petrograd at the time, and the Weibull districts and so on, were saying. So that's why the argument that the October Revolution was a coup carried out by a minority is a complete mistake. Imagine, I mean, there's some people who would like to do this, but imagine that we took the few hundred of us that exist in socialist works by people before profit or whatever, but a few other people, and marched on the Doyle and tried to occupy it. What would happen? Actually, we know. I personally know what would happen because Mary Smith, my partner, tried to do this ahead of a few people just to get in, not really a revolution. And what happened was that a guard stood in front of her and hit her over the head with a truncheon. That's what they would do, isn't it? One person in this room tried to occupy the Ministry of Finance for a sit-in for a couple of an hour or so. The guards came in, the 30 or 40 people who were sitting in there were dragged out and beaten up. That's what they did, right? You couldn't do it without. Why didn't that happen when they occupied the Winter Palace? Why didn't that happen if it was a coup carried out by a few thousand people? Why did that not happen? It didn't happen because all the Russian equivalent of the Garde had disintegrated. The soldiers had come over to the side of the revolution, and the Tsar had nobody left, apart from a few soldiers to defend him. So when they took power in Petrograd, it only could be done in one night with almost nobody getting killed, because the revolution had already conquered not just the masses, which it had, and the Bolsheviks had majority support for this in the workers' councils, but because they'd also effectively broken the old state machine, and the existing regime, the provisional government had nobody left to defend it. So that view's also false. So if we come to why then did it all go wrong, I think we have to offer a Marxist explanation of why it went wrong. And a Marxist explanation means beginning with the objective material conditions and the state of the class struggle, and it means looking at the Russian Revolution in its international context. That's what I'm going to say. In other words, you begin with the big picture and you begin with the real social forces. This doesn't mean to say that what individuals didn't matter, that what parties didn't matter. We come into that, but you have to start from those real circumstances. Now, I want to argue that there were two fundamental factors involved which interacted. The best way to do it, to describe it, would be to talk about how these two factors interacted all along, but I'm going to separate them just because it's easier to explain it. The two factors I'm going to talk about are, first, the economic backwardness and poverty of Russia, the very extreme deprivation that they suffered, and secondly, the isolation of the revolution, the failure of the revolution to spread to other countries. It was the interaction of these. I mean, clearly, I think you can see how they would be interacting, because if the revolution had spread to lots of other countries, you could have got aid to Russia to deal with problems of deprivation and so on, and it would have taken the pressure off that kind of one. Let me start with the economic backwardness. Now, in European terms, Russia was a backward, sometimes you might say, the most economically underdeveloped country in Europe. In 1917, in 1930, before things got even worse during the World War, the large majority of the population were peasants. Agriculture was still a sort of equivalent at the level of Britain, say, in the 17th century, when Britain, had its civil war and the English Revolution that brought Cromwell to power, and so on. The working class, depending on how you count it, is something like 5 to 10% of the population, but a tiny minority in a large sea of peasants. And this gets dramatically worse. The first thing that worsens the economic level of the country is the World War itself, in which Russia suffers extreme casualties and so on, and it suffers more casualties than any of the other European contenders. This is a major factor driving the revolution, of course, but it doesn't mean to say that the devastating effects are not there, the disruption of industry, the shortages of food, etc., etc. Then it gets worse after that, because in the period immediately after the revolution, first they lose a load of territory to the Germans who are invading the country, and they have to make a horrible peace at Brest-Litovsk just to survive. Painful, they didn't want to do it, but they had to do it, no choice, as Lenin realised at the time, which lost them a whole lot of territory, which was extremely economically important. And then it gets even worse, because they're plunged into a civil war by the white generals who are trying to restore Tsarism, with the aid of almost all the European and international, not just European, international capitalist countries. As soon as they got over their little quarrel amongst themselves that caused the First World War, they set upon Russia by sending troops. They sent about 250,000 troops. No choice but to fight. But the consequences of this were terrible for the country. Just go through just some idea. The Civil War, or the War of Intervention, call it either, costs about 3 million dead altogether. 1.5 million on the red side, on the revolutionary side. And it's worth thinking about who those people would be. Many of them were peasants. but many of them were also the workers who had led the revolution. These were the people who went to the front lines to strengthen the Red Army and so on. So the toll is talk of the very people who made the revolution in 1917 was enormous. But even worse in some respects than this were the economic effects. Large areas, the most productive areas of Russia, were taken out of the hands of the revolution, which had huge knock-on effects. For example, they lost coal from the Donetsk basin, they lost iron and grain from the Ukraine and from the Urals. They lost oil from Baku and so on. And this meant that industrial production in Russia fell to a quarter of its pre-revolutionary level. It was never very high, as I said, but it fell enormously in these years. I mean, when we experience a recession in which production falls by 5% or 10%, that's a catastrophe. Imagine it's falling by 75, 80%. This is the kind of figures we're talking about. Utter catastrophe. Indeed, and we're talking about Russia with its poor housing, with its dreadful cold, and so on. People were starving, literally. The starvation sends people back to the countryside to get food. At least they get food. Many of them are first-generation peasants and so on. There's no food in the cities. They go back to the countryside. To try and deal with the starvation, the Bolshevik government initiates food requisitions, which they have to do at a point of a gun. There's no other way of getting it. That antagonizes the peasants, which leads to conflicts, one of which was mentioned earlier. You mentioned it with Kronstadt and various other things, but it exacerbates tensions in the country. These are not things that anybody wanted to do. These are things they had to do to deal with the fact that the cities were faced with starvation. It means a terrible spread of illness, disease, and so on as well. About 5 million people in these years get typhus. 1.7 million of those died. There's cholera as well, and all sorts of illness and disease. Now, what does this mean in social and political terms? In social and political terms, it means that the workers who made the revolution in 1917 are, and I use a phrase taken from Lenin at the time, dislodged from their class groove. They kind of effectively, as a conscious, cohesive class, cease to exist. The combination of dying at the front, of the factories ceasing to operate, mass unemployment, starvation, illness means that that working class base of the whole revolution kind of disintegrates. Now, what happens then? It means that the people who stand at the head of the apparatus of the state, some of whom were still people from old officials, but the core of whom were supporters of the revolution, the Bolsheviks, they cease to be subject to democratic control. Right? Now, this is not because they chose to be. This is because the workers who should exert that democratic control, and did exert that democratic control through the Soviets in 1917, they're disintegrated and they've fallen away. They're no longer able to exercise workers' control of the economy or workers' control of the state. Now, the people who stopped being subject to democratic control were, in the main, genuine revolutionaries who remained committed to the goals of the revolution. But again, material conditions are more important in the final analysis than just what's going on in people's heads. And gradually, in the years that followed, not that gradually either, the next 2 or 3, 4 years, they become transformed into a bureaucracy. What is a bureaucracy? A bureaucracy is a layer of officials who are not subject to democratic control, and that's what they were. And they more and more started to act as a bureaucracy. Now, was there a way out of this situation? There was a possible way out of this situation, but the way out of this situation was to spread the revolution internationally. Now, that was not a pipe dream. The Bolsheviks, by the way, and Trotsky and all the rest of them, all knew from the beginning that you wouldn't be able to create a socialist society in Russia on its own. Their aim was never socialism in one country. Their aim was to spread the revolution. Lenin said on countless occasions, unless there's a revolution in Germany, which is the most important European country, we'll be doomed. They knew that they couldn't survive unless they spread the revolution to other countries. That's one of the reasons why they formed the Communist International and so on. And they knew it, and it wasn't a pipe dream. It very nearly happened. In 1919, there was revolutionary upheaval right across Europe. The bourgeoisie, people like Lloyd George and so on, were in a panic about it. The revolutionary optimism was enormous, whether you're talking about Italy, or you're talking about Germany, or you're talking about Britain, or you're talking about Ireland. There was a huge wave of revolutionary struggle sweeping across Europe. Tragically, and there isn't time to tell this story in full here, but we do, but it's a fact, these revolutions failed. We would argue that one of the main reasons they failed is that they didn't have a Bolshevik-type party. Far from it being Bolshevism that caused the failure of the Russian Revolution, it was lack of Bolshevism, lack of a Bolshevik party in Ireland or in the UK, or crucially in Germany. One had just been formed in Germany, originally by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, but they got assassinated. There was a young Communist Party that didn't have the training, it made huge errors and so on. And there wasn't one in Italy. Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian revolutionary, learned from the experience of the failure of the Italian Revolution that he needed a Bolshevik party and formed the Italian Communist Party with others, but too late, and so on. By the time they'd really started to get organised, they already had Mussolini, and so on. But anyway, without going through that whole story, for which there's not time, the revolution didn't spread internationally. And the effect of this was to reinforce Stalinism, to reinforce the lack of control over the bureaucracy. Just a word about Joseph Stalin here. Stalin did not create the bureaucracy, at least not initially. But the bureaucrats chose Stalin. Stalin put forward the policy of socialism in one country. The first time this had been put forward in the Russian Marxist movement, or in the Marxist movement generally, in 1924. They grasped this instinctively because they understood by the victory of socialism in one country their victory, the victory of the bureaucracy, so they seized on this stuff. This in turn damaged the international revolution, because once you said the main thing is to build socialism in Russia alone, then you start turning the international communist movement, the international revolutionary movement, into agents of the Russian state. This then fed into further defeats, like the defeat of the general strike in Britain in 1926, the defeat of the Great Revolutionary Movement in China in 1925-27, and ultimately, in the ultimate horror, the defeat of the German working class by Hitler in 1933 and the advent of the Nazi regime. So socialism in one country became a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of the lack of spread of the Russian Revolution. But what did socialism in one country turn out to mean in practice? And this is the last point I want to make. It meant that Russia had to become strong enough, and the bureaucracy certainly wanted this, to survive by competing with Western capitalism, which was more advanced, richer, and better armed, and so on its own terms. What did that mean? That in turn meant that the bureaucracy had to industrialize, it had to develop the arms industry of the country, it had to strengthen itself, or, as they thought, Western countries, Western capitalism would crush them, but they could only do so by exploiting their own working class and their own peasantry. And so what you find is that in the name of socialism, you get a series of policies, particularly the first 5-year plan, the forced collectivization of agriculture, that extract a huge surplus out of the Russian working class for the purposes of accumulation, a huge surplus out of the Russian peasantry, destroy the standard of living of workers and peasants, and you cannot do that by democratic means. to do that, you have to have a dictatorship, and that is why you've got all the kind of measures that I talked about. That's why you had purges, why you had the gulag, why you had the police state, why you had the dictatorship. What this was the state performing the role that, say, the British bourgeoisie had performed during the Industrial Revolution in Britain in the 1780s and 90s, or other bourgeoisies have performed in history of developing the country and developing its industry at the expense of the working class. What it was not socialism, but bureaucratic state capitalism. And this essentially, I want to argue, is why and how things went wrong. I just repeat. The combination of the economic, social, political disaster that befell the revolution in attempting to survive in the Civil War against the onslaught on it, interacted with the failure of the revolution to spread, that forced the destruction of the Russian working class, unable to control the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy then becomes a force for re-establishing its rule and the rule of state capitalism in Russia. That's what went wrong. The solution, I'll say more in the summing up, so I'm running out of time here. The implications for today are actually quite hopeful because we're more advanced and the international links are better, but the lesson is that you need to build revolutionary parties everywhere.
Thank you, John. So we have time for debate, discussion, questions, or just even small observations. Please signal by putting up your hand. I'll take a list of people, and then at the end we'll come back. We'll ask John to come back and maybe answer any questions and maybe do a bit of a summary.
I was talking about, should just say, related to the period that I was talking about earlier, which is the Civil War, the period from 1919 to 1921. Unfortunately, world history and Russian history is full of terrible suffering. And I didn't speak about the period of the Second World War because by then I think the revolution was already lost. But the sufferings of the Russian people, of the people of Eastern Europe, of the people of Germany, the sufferings in the Second World War dwarfed those in the First World War. The First World War was bad enough. Number of people who died in the First World War was something like 10 to 16 million. The number of people who died in the Second World War, because technology had advanced and was on a bigger scale, was up to 50 million. You know, I didn't speak about it, but I do know from both reading and from people I've known, I have some sense of what happened to the people of Eastern Europe during that time. I mean, one of my best friends, his father, tragically, was from the Ukraine and fought, because they had suffered so much under Stalin, fought with the Vlasov regiment, which supported Hitler. Terrible mistake, but because they were so bitter about the suffering of the Ukrainian people under Stalin, when maybe 2 to 3, it's a horrible period. And he grew up in a displaced person camp. He later became a revolutionary socialist, but people change, circumstances change as well. It was his parents. So, but I do know something. I didn't speak about it because it's not part of the subject. But the point that you made about Stalin as an individual and his cruelty relates directly to the point that you made at the beginning, Margaret, about if Lenin had lived and so on. And I'd like to say a few words about this because I think it's important that we understand in the whole process the relationship between, if you like, the masses and social forces and individuals. And this is crucial for understanding the whole process. Let me just say that as far as Stalin's personality is concerned, Stalin was, and I quote here from memory, Tony Cliff, who you referred to, Stalin was a bastard from the beginning. That's what Cliff simply. Not the lack of.
His parents trained him to be a priest.
It did indeed, no doubt. If this had been different, he would have been. He would have been. You know, we know a lot about bad priests in our but Stalin was a bastard from the beginning. But something else that Trotsky said about Stalin, that if somebody had told Stalin at the beginning, say in 1917, the historical role that he was going to perform, he would have recoiled in horror. Because if he may have been about, you can see lots of bad things he did, and his personality was horrible. And a man called Erich Fromm, a Marxist psychoanalyst, did a psychological study of Stalin and defined him as a non-sexual sadist. But he became the monster he became through the social forces of the time. And one thing you find in history, tragically, is when counter-revolution develops, they never actually run out of torturers and murderers. There's enough, the system produces enough people to perform that function, whether it's for Allende in Chile, or it's for Hitler, or whoever it may be. But, and here I go back to, I agree with what James said at the beginning, that this doesn't mean that it was Stalin's personality that drove the process. It didn't. In 1917, you read the records of 1917 itself, Stalin barely figures. He was not a leader of the revolution. Trotsky was the public face of the revolution. It was Trotsky who became the president of the Petrograd Soviet. It was Trotsky who was the main organizer of the October Revolution through the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet. And Lenin was the inspirer more behind the scenes of things and the leader of the body. Stalin is a minor figure. Stalin comes into his own as the bureaucratization sets in. The bureaucratization sets in because the working class ceases to be able to exercise democratic control, and then as the bureaucracy strengthens, so they support Stalin and his faction against those who wanted to remain loyal to the revolution and wanted to spread the revolution, who became known as Trotskyists. Right? And why did the leaders of the Bolshevik Party and the majority of the Bolshevik Party support Stalin, not Trotsky? Not because Stalin was cleverer than Trotsky, not because he outmaneuvered him, etc., but because they were becoming bureaucratized and Stalin represented what they want. That's the sense in which they chose Stalin, and they chose Stalin in the period between 1923 and 1927. Having been chosen in that way, Stalin goes on to build up his personal power and to reinforce it and to start choosing the bureaucrats and so on. These two processes are interacting. He's building an apparatus already in 1923, 24 and so on. So my sentence is shorthand for a long process. But if the working class had remained in control and confident and strong, they would not have allowed Stalin to emerge. And that's extremely important. And I'll come back to that in terms of lessons for today. But this also kind of answers your question, Ari. Krupskaya, Lenin's partner, widow after he died, was asked privately. She was sympathetic to the left opposition for a period. They said, what if Vladimir Ilyich had survived? She said he'd be in one of Stalin's prisons. Mm-hmm. Now, what does that mean? Could Lenin by himself have made a difference? No. Now, I don't think the course of history is absolutely determined. I think there were turning points. The most important turning point in this whole process was the failure of the German Revolution, especially in 1923. Mm-hmm. If the revolution had spread to Germany in 1923, then I think it would have taken in would have spread to the rest of Europe probably, would have relieved the pressure on Russia, and they could have got aid to Russia, and so on. And I think it's likely there would have been no Hitler and probably no Stalin and so on. But this is guesswork. Now, it's possible Lenin died in the beginning of 1924, but he was out of political action because he was paralyzed from the end of 1922. If Lenin had lived to 1923 and had had all his faculties, and Lenin and Trotsky had combined as they were thinking of doing, and they had been able to exert a positive rather than a negative influence on the leaders of the German Communist Party, maybe the German Revolution could have succeeded in 23, and then all history would have been different. So in that sense, possibly. What wouldn't have been the case, though, is that because Lenin was a genuine Democrat, but to the other point, because Lenin was a genuine Democrat, which he was, Russia would have survived as a democracy and so on. Russia became a dictatorship because of the circumstances, not because of battle leaders. The position of the Mensheviks, I don't know if you realise that, that's exactly what they argued at the time, and also the position of the German Social Democrats, most notably Karl Kautsky and so on, argued more or less word for word what
Hitler's.
Sorry?
Hitler's.
Okay, but more or less word for word. The same argument. It goes on today. The first question that is involved here is not just about the Soviets, but the first question here is about the nature of their capitalist state. Now, you say here, the question is, can the working class take over and use the existing capitalist state for its own purposes? Now, on this question, though you're quite right to say that Marx and Engels were in favour of a democratic republic, they were, and they were consistent Democrats and believed in democracy and so on. But as a result of the experience of the Paris Commune, Marx actually amended the Communist Manifesto and said that the experience of the Paris Commune, which was a fresh institution created from below by the workers, he said it proved that the working class couldn't actually take over the existing state apparatus. That state apparatus would always serve the capitalist class, and it was necessary to smash it and to create a genuine workers' alternative, to which he pointed to the Paris Commune. So I think that Marx's position on this was fairly clear. The question of the Constituent Assembly and so on in Russia is interesting. The provisional government that ruled Russia from the February Revolution through to the October Revolution had plenty of opportunity to call the Constituent Assembly and didn't. That was part of their program. They didn't even implement their own program on that case. The only time when they became enthusiasts for the Constituent Assembly was when they could counterpose it. The Bolsheviks did call it, when they could counterpose it to Soviet power. And I think it's right to say that it became the banner of the counter-revolution. And you know, I said that in 1989, 1991, nobody actually defended, the workers didn't defend these states that were supposedly, that were supposedly worker states. No, they didn't defend them. Similarly, right, it's very interesting that when the Soviets disbanded the Constituent Assembly, nobody defended it. It didn't really represent the mass of the workers. I think that Soviets for workers' councils elected from workplaces with recallable delegates, which is what they were in Russia, are much more democratic than any capitalist parliament. They allow much greater flexibility. They're much more expressive of the will of the masses. They're much more genuinely democratic. The point, though, here, and it comes back to the role of individuals, it's the same. In the end, forms of government, forms of constitution, forms of institutions of rules and so on, by themselves are not enough. if the actual democratic content isn't supplied by the workers, and that fell away because of the circumstances that I was describing and that once upon a time I had pictures of, because of that, then it didn't matter whether you called them Soviets or Parliament or Constituent Assembly or anything else, it wasn't going to be able to be genuinely democratic if the workers weren't able to, and so on. This then relates to your points, Roy. I was interested to hear the story of Cliff, who was a big influence on my life personally. But there we go. I would just say this, that democratic control of production is essential. But you can't have democratic control of production under capitalism. You have to have democratic control of production and democratic control of the state. We have to have both going together, and we can't get democratic control of the state without getting rid of the capitalist state and having workers' councils. The last point I want to make, time is running out, I made it in hints here, but I want to come back to it. And it a bit relates to your question. So people always ask you, how do you answer in 2 lines the thing? It's not easy to answer any of these questions in 2 lines. You can say what I've said very quickly, but it's not easy. But it relates to the situation today. I would say, the first thing I would say to people is, look, Russia wasn't socialist, it's state capitalist. And once upon a time, right, it's quite right, the Marxist movement found that a very strange idea. But now you say it to people who go, yeah, that makes sense. They can see it now. So I say that, and I use state capitalist not as if it's a strange Marxist theory developed by Tony Cliff. I use it as it's obvious. The state was the capitalist that exploited people. That's not socialism. For socialism, you need people power, workers' power. That's the first thing I say. And I just say this, that if you look at how the world has developed since then, we usually look back and think things were better in those days. But today, first of all, if you were to talk about Egypt, or you were to talk about Brazil, or you were to talk about China, I just mentioned those 3, not at random, but those 3 countries. In 1917, there was no working class, or barely any working class in any of those countries. Today, they have working classes of hundreds of millions of people. The Chinese working class alone dwarfs the whole international working class that existed in 1917. In the great cities of Egypt, you have 10, 20 million people in Cairo. In Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, millions of those. The working class is enormously stronger on the world scale than it was then. The economies are more developed, we have far more resources, and we're more internationally linked. When the Russian Revolution happened, news took months to get to Western Europe. I mentioned Gramsci earlier. Gramsci had no communication with Lenin for a couple of years and barely knew anything about him. John Reed, the American journalist, took him months to get across to spread the word. Now we all know that the word of the revolution would be spread within minutes of its happening. You would be watching Trotsky not addressing thousands of people in the Cirque Moderne, the modern circus in Petrograd or in the Petrograd Soviet. That would be beamed worldwide. The effect, the international communications, the international integration of the economy would mean the spreading of the revolution internationally would be enormously easier today. So we know that, we all pay the price. Many people think socialism equals Russia. We pay the price for that in popular consciousness. But objectively, and that wins out at the end, the strength of the working class, the international integration of the world, and the world crisis, including the environmental crisis, means that we would have every chance to avoid any repetition of the Stalinist disaster, in my opinion. Okay.
Thank you very much.